Good afternoon. My name is Rachel Dunsmore, and I'm a senior analyst with GAO's International Affairs and Trade team and a steering committee member of the Women and Gender Policy Issues Community of Practice. On behalf of the steering committee, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this event celebrating GAO's Centennial with a panel discussion featuring 3 distinguished women from the Comptroller General's Advisory Board and our very own Chief Operating Officer. The goal of our Community of Practice, or COP, is to serve as a resource on women's and gender policy issues for staff across the agency, particularly related to GAO's audit work. The COP provides a forum for members to share knowledge, deepen expertise, build networks, and engage in discussion of timely public policy issues, as we are doing today. The COP came together in 2016 because over the years, GAO has made significant contributions to women's and gender policy issues, issuing more than 270 publications with this focus since 2006. GAO has examined issues ranging from women in the military to women in science, technology, engineering, and math fields, as well as women's reproductive health, retirement security, and representation on corporate boards, to name just a few. This work is featured on GAO's new Key Issues page on women and gender and public policy. We encourage you to visit this page to learn more about the broad range of GAO work on this topic. And as we celebrate GAO's 100th anniversary, we can be proud of the significant contributions that GAO has made to these issues. We can also be proud of the number of women who have been and continue to be a part of GAO's history. In 1980, women made up 33% of the agency. Today, 58% of GAO employees are women. GAO's history of female leadership is also noteworthy. In the mid-1980s, women made up just 6% of senior executive service positions. By the year 2000, the year before the Comptroller General's Advisory Board was created, the share of female executives had risen to 35%. In 2010, the year before our Chief Operating Officer became a managing director, female leadership at the agency had increased to 43%. Today, 55% of the agency's senior executives are women. The COP is honored to feature one of these senior executives today, as well as 3 other women leaders who provide strategic direction and guidance to the agency. Before I introduce our COO and moderator of today's event, I would like to go over a few logistical notes. Our moderated panel discussion will be about 50 minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. This portion of the event will be moderated by my fellow steering committee member, Leila Mugari, a senior analyst in the Education, Workforce, and Income Security team. All attendees will be muted throughout the event. Approximately 10 minutes prior to the conclusion of the panel, we will invite you to type your questions for the panelists into the chat box. We'll be monitoring the chat box to field your questions once the panel discussion ends, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can in the time available. With that, I'd like to get our event started by introducing you to Oris Williams-Brown, GAO's Chief Operating Officer. Oris has over 30 years of service with GAO. As the COO, she assists the Comptroller General in providing vision and leadership to the agency. Prior to becoming the COO this year, Oris served for 4 years as the Managing Director of GAO's Office of Congressional Relations, examining the receipt of hundreds of congressional requests and mandates for GAO work, as well as serving as a liaison between GAO and congressional members and committees. From 2011 to 2017, she was the Managing Director of the Financial Markets and Community Investment team, in which she oversaw GAO's work on a variety of cross-cutting policy issues, including housing and financial regulatory oversight, consumer and investor protection, small business programs, insurance industry oversight, and Treasury's Troubled Asset Relief Program, or TARP. In 2013, Oris was recognized by the Partnership for Public Service with a Career Achievement Award for her oversight of GAO reports on financial market and housing issues, including reports that made recommendations to improve Treasury's management of TARP. Oris, it's an honor to have you as our moderator today, and I'm now delighted to call upon you to begin our panel discussion. Oris, over to you.
Thanks, Rachel. I'm excited to moderate this event in honor of GAO's first 100 years. With such accomplished panelists representing the Comptroller General's Advisory Board, I don't think I'm alone in saying that I'm looking forward to hearing from these distinguished women about how GAO has evolved since they began advising the agency to learn more about their careers, including how gender intersects with their respective fields, and to get their thoughts on public policy challenges that GAO may encounter in its work over the next 100 years. The purpose of the Comptroller General's Advisory Board is to bring together leaders across a range of fields to provide advice to the CG and GAO's Executive Committee in carrying out the mission of the agency. The board plays an important role in helping inform GAO's foresight and keeping a pulse on a variety of critical issues to identify potential opportunities, challenges, and developments that are relevant to GAO's future. All three of our panelists have served on the advisory board for more than 10 years, with two having served since it was established in 2001. GAO has certainly benefited from their insights over the years, and I'm delighted that today more of our staff will have an opportunity to hear from these board members as well. Our guests today have extraordinary backgrounds. Diana Aviv joined the board in 2009. She's the founding CEO of Partners for American Democracy, an organization that supports efforts to strengthen democracy in the United States. Ms. Aviv was formerly the CEO of Feeding America, the largest hunger relief organization in the United States, as well as the former CEO of both Alternative to Domestic Violence and the Independent Sector, a national membership organization of cross-sector groups working to strengthen civil society. Next, we have Dr. Shirley Ann Jackson, a physicist who holds a PhD in theoretical elementary particle physics from MIT. She is president of Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute and former co-chair of President Obama's Intelligence Advisory Board. She has also served as a member of President Obama's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology and has chaired the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Finally, Dr. Susan Forbes Martin holds a PhD in the history of American civilization from the University of Pennsylvania and is the founder and former chair of Georgetown University's Institute for the Study of International Migration. She is formerly the executive director of the U.S. Commission on Immigration Reform, established to advise Congress and the president on immigration and refugee policy. Professor Martin is the former president of the International Association for the Study of Forced Migration and the former director of research and programs at the Refugee Policy Group. Thank you all again for joining us today and commemorating GAO's centennial. With that, we can get started with the discussion. So I'm going to start with a question based on your backgrounds. So given your respective backgrounds, we know that you're likely invited to many boards. Why was it important to you to join GAO's CG Advisory Board? And if we could start with Dr. Jackson, if you want to kick us off with this.
Sure, thank you. Well, I felt it was important to join the GAO Comptroller General's Advisory Board really for two reasons, both that derive from my background. First, I felt that it was an important way to serve the nation. And that's because the GAO has such an important and unique role in ensuring the best possible current performance of our federal government, as well as intelligent preparation for the future. And given my own background in government and some of the things that you enunciated, I thought it was important to serve in this way. The second big reason is that many of the issues that the GAO addresses are issues that we focus on at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute from a somewhat different angle, including cybersecurity, the risks of climate change, the need for human capital in science and technology, and of course, the risks and opportunities of emerging technology. So, you know, I feel that I'm able to contribute from these perspectives. And in the process, you know, I gain perspectives to inform my own leadership.
Excellent. Thank you for that. So next, Diana, do you want to respond next?
Sure. Well, thank you for having us. And it's delightful to be with you and with all of the folks with whom you work. This organization, this department, is an extraordinarily important part of our government. This is the people's opportunity for accountability from our federal officials. And I think it engenders confidence and trust, or it enables confidence and trust because of the high level of work that is done on a nonpartisan basis and reports that are given to Congress and that are available for voters and everybody else to see, that tells us about the state of our government. I've also found over the years that the level of study, review, analysis, and discussion is at such a high level that it continues to give me confidence that the General Accountability Office is an essential part of our government, and that the people who work there are critical value adds to our society. So why wouldn't I want to be a part of this council, of this advisory board?
Excellent. Thank you so much for that. Dr. Martin?
Yes, thank you. Well, I had worked for quite a number of years with staff at GAO before David Walker asked me to join the advisory board. And I was absolutely delighted to do so because I'd found in my encounters that the evidence-based research and analysis and investigations that the GAO did were absolutely essential to keeping the government running properly. And you can just tell how influential GAO is by the very large number of recommendations it makes that people have said afterwards, you know, that these were vital. And even though nobody likes to be told by the GAO that they're doing things wrong, what I found was that government agencies really did think that it was important to correct those problems. And so many of the recommendations are adopted each year as the reports come out. This has been particularly important in my field in immigration. When I was heading up the Immigration Commission in the 1990s, and then an earlier one, I was research director in the late 70s and 80s. Whenever we talked with members of Congress about recommendations we plan to make, very often their willingness to support them was contingent on whether GAO would be able to monitor their implementation. It was what made them confident that they weren't embarking on a policy that would have adverse effects that they didn't know about and couldn't change. So for that reason, I thought it was a fantastic opportunity. I learned a lot more about GAO's work. I've benefited from the experience and the expertise and insights of other members of the advisory board, and I appreciate that in my small way, I may be helping the leadership and staff of GAO who are working on immigration, refugees, and other issues to know more about the field and tackling their terribly important projects.
Excellent. Thank you for that. And I can tell you from personal experience, having participated in a couple of discussions with the CG advisory board members, that you all have provided, you know, just excellent insights and food for thought for us as we're thinking about work that we're going to be doing. And many of you have also supported our efforts and ongoing work. So we continue to be eternally grateful for all of you and are extremely happy that you all heeded the call to participate in the Comptroller General's advisory board. So next we want to talk a little bit about how gender intersects with your work. And, you know, each of you have charted different paths with your careers, but the commonality is we all have a shared gender. So I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about that intersection and how it's impacted each of you in your respective areas. So I don't know if maybe Ms. Aviv, you want to kick us off for this one?
Sure. You know, I was thinking about this question, and I couldn't help but remembering that when I was a much younger professional, and I was what one might call a mid-level staffer, my ability to shape and to influence gender participation in organizations, firstly, it was many years before, and I also didn't have the influence. As when I moved into leadership roles, I had the opportunity to make sure that the people who served on the boards of directors, the people who were hired at the most senior levels, included talented, capable women, so that the combination was always easily 50-50 in all of those spheres of endeavor. I'm convinced that if women in leadership roles don't take proactive steps to make sure that commitment to gender equality and participation at all levels happens all the time, we kind of slip back. I had an opportunity to do research a couple of years ago for a client with whom I was working, who wanted to study the trajectory of what happens to women in the workforce. And even though even in recent years, they came in the same numbers as men, that there was all kinds of subtle messaging that happened, both in the workforce, in the business community, as well as in the social sector, the nonprofit sector, and other spheres of engagement, where women over time would lose ground and wouldn't be promoted and advanced at the same levels. So if there isn't a particular approach, policy, plan, and consistent oversight to make sure that happens, one could find oneself in a position where the people one's promoting are disproportionately men, because efforts weren't taken to support, encourage, and to make sure that women advanced at the same rate as men. So those are just some of the things I've been thinking about.
Very good. Thank you for that. Dr. Martin, do you want to talk a little bit about your views on the intersection?
Sure. I see these issues, as I do most, through the migration prism, but even before I got into migration research and teaching and policy, in the early 1970s, I helped establish the Women's Studies program at Brandeis University, where I was teaching. And later on, I began to work very much on refugee women's issues. I published the first book on that subject in the early 1990s. Also did some work on women and migration more generally for the UN, the predecessor to UN Women. And so this is an issue that I care about deeply in my own work. And as it's been interesting from my own perspective in seeing the evolution from gender being mostly women's studies or women's issues to also now having work, and I've seen that GAO has had that evolution as well, to look at sexual orientation, gender identity, issues pertaining to men that have also not been given very much attention. So I think it's really important as an issue that overlays just about everything. A lot of the research I've been doing over the last maybe 10 years, so it's been a continuing interest, has been on climate change and its impact on mobility. And I've been actually quite surprised at how little research there is on the impact of climate change on migration, displacement, relocation of people from a gendered perspective, because we know that climate change has a disproportionately negative impact on women, particularly in rural areas where they're responsible for agriculture. and experiencing the impacts of increased drought and rising sea levels and all of the other things that we worry about with regard to climate change. We also know that inequality is a driver of migration, both it drives it and it also impedes it. And so the fact that we haven't really looked very systematically at how these three issues intersect, gender, climate change, and mobility, is for me somewhat shocking. And it's something that I really hope that GAO, amongst others, will pick up on in trying to really understand what are both the direct impacts on women of climate change and mobility, but also what are the indirect impacts that will likely make them even more vulnerable as the years pass, unless we really try to approach these issues right now from a gendered point of view. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Jackson.
Well, I work in obviously the fields of science and technology and lead an institution that's focused on that. But, you were asking about working in the fields we work in and that intersection. The intersection for me, though, has not been pure gender. It's the intersection of gender and race. And so let me, if you indulge me, take just a minute to talk about, I have to sort of articulate first, how did I get here? Well, I grew up in Washington, D.C. And when I began my primary level education, the public schools in Washington were segregated by law. And so my life changed because of the confluence of two major events, nearly coincident in time. The first was the US Supreme Court Brown v. Board of Education decision that led to the desegregation of the public schools. And the schools were desegregated in Washington right away, starting essentially the next year. And the second pivotal event was the Soviet launch of the Sputnik 1 satellite that riveted the country's attention on attracting and preparing young Americans to pursue STEM careers. And so by the sixth grade, I was tested and placed into an accelerated academic track. I excelled. I was my high school valedictorian. I did very well on the SATs, and I was admitted to MIT. And so that's kind of the launch pad. But even with that kind of early start, one can face both conscious and unconscious bias. In fact, a number of studies suggest the ways that stereotypes about their abilities disadvantage women and underrepresented minorities in the sciences. And again, to just personalize it, if you'll indulge me, as an undergraduate at MIT, I sought the advice of a distinguished professor when I was considering majoring in physics. What he told me was that colored girls should learn a trade. Now, of course, I was rather hurt by that because I was doing well in his class. So it was interesting that his expectations were so low. And so I then understood and have had a philosophy that, of course, heritage is by chance, success is by choice. And so chance had made me a woman, an African-American. I was happy with that. But I knew I had choices. So I decided not to give in to that. And, I tended to stay focused. But having said that, not all women's stories play out the same way. And many of them are discouraged fairly early on. And many young women opt out of science at too early an age. And interestingly enough, I put this in the following context, because I think it's very important. I long have spoken of what I call a quiet crisis in our nation as a whole, as it relates to science and STEM. And the reason I've talked about this is that by failing to attract women and minorities in significant numbers to science and engineering, the United States is limiting its own capacity for innovation. And so, many times, and rightfully so, the discussion is about, what happens to women. But what I talk about is what happens to this country if we don't tap the complete talent pool. And the crisis is quiet because it in fact plays out over time. It takes many years to educate a scientist or engineer. But when there is a shortfall in critical areas because of the long human capital development times, it is a crisis. And so it's something that I think we have to pay more attention to, the underdevelopment of talent. And if you think about it, given the career opportunities in this particular field, it's puzzling and concerning that the percentage of bachelor's degrees awarded to women in computer sciences has declined over the last 20 years, from 27% in 1998 to 20% in 2018. So we have an issue here, and we're at a critical moment. And I know that the GAO thinks a lot about these things, particularly workforce capacity and the like. But we can't overlook 60 to almost 2/3 of our talent pool and feel that we're going to move ahead. So that was really something I think we have to think deeply about.
No, thank you for that. So continuing, with the discussion, all of you know that GAO has done a considerable amount of work on policy issues and programs related to gender over the past decade in particular. How have you seen GAO's approach to these issues evolve over this period? And if you have any thoughts about going forward, please feel free to share those as well. So I think Dr.
Well, I don't mind starting.
Great. Okay.
Okay. So again, I want to go back to the question about essential talent. And, I think the GAO does critical studies. It's we obviously have laws and regulations and policies that are designed to prevent discrimination based on gender. And the GAO has done some important work in flagging disparities in the outcomes between the sexes that point to failures in the way that policies are implemented. And I've seen the GAO ask very important questions, such as why women are, as others have mentioned, underrepresented on public company and, for instance, federal home loan boards, why the pay gap persists in the federal workforce, why women scientists are less likely to receive research funding from some federal agencies, and why even maternal mortality is 3 times as high in African-American women and twice as high in American Indian, Alaskan Native women as in white women. So these things they're very sensitive, kind of third rail issues, but I've seen the GAO be willing to step into it, but because it is so data driven, I think what the work it does stands on its own and has impact.
I can step in next because my comments are going to be very much a follow-up to Shirley's. And that's that I think that what I've seen is GAO using its strength in terms of that evidence base and data-driven analyses, but also now moving into it, I think it's a much more nuanced view of gender and what it means to be looking at gender as a measure. I think there's a lot more in the work over the last few years that is doing more sense of intersectionality of seeing that it's not just add women and stir, it's not just comparing men and women, but having to go down the line of really looking at how gender intersects with race, with poverty, with where people are living, and the circumstances in which they're experiencing life. And that I think that that's a direction that GAO really needs to keep building on, so that the work that you're doing isn't pigeonholing the findings into looking at just a particular characteristic, but looking at how all of the characteristics coincide in a way that has particularly harmful effects on some populations, and doing a more holistic set of recommendations about how to address the problems more systemically than just in terms of a comparison of what do men do, what do women do. So I think that you're all on the route there, very much so. But I hope that just the beginning, and we'll continue going down that path even more.
Great, thank you.
Arisa, I'm going to offer a slightly different perspective from my experience with GAO. And I know you all said we shouldn't prepare for this, but I did take it, since I didn't know the concrete answer to this, of how deeply involved you were, I did a quick peek at the website and some of the issues you focused on, and was very pleasantly surprised to see a lot more than I knew, which suggests to me, not that I'm the expert, but that it would be great if there was a way of broadcasting, sharing with non-governmental agencies the kind of work and studies and research that you've done that would aid in their work. I think that there's a really important role for public-private partnership in terms of learning and understanding about community. That said, the part that gives me ever so slight pause is I've been coming to these meetings now for over 10 years, and I don't remember, maybe my memory is faulty, Susan, you remind me, because we often have sat opposite each other or near one another, but I don't remember our having specific agenda items around this issue, whereas we've had agenda items around many other issues, but this one wasn't on the table. So it seems to be infused into what's done, not a discrete item by itself. In contrast, just the other day when we had our last meeting that you were at, where you served as there was a clear effort on all of the discussion we have to talk about the pernicious effects of race on all of the issues. I don't remember ever hearing conversations about the pernicious effect of excluding women on issues. And what I hope we don't do, and I think what Shirley said earlier about her own prism of experience, race and gender, and the way you described it, Shirley, in terms of your own experience, I would say is also true here as well, that we can't say, oh, we've passed that issue, now we're on to the next one, and treat these as issues, because these are half of American society. The challenges we face have in our society has to do with targeted populations being excluded. And as the official government agency for oversight, it is incumbent to go the extra mile to make sure that there is a prism of inclusiveness on both race and gender that persists across the board and is part of everybody's discussions beginning to end.
Thank you for that. So continuing with this question, and I'm going to probe a little deeper in terms of what do you see as some of the key emerging issues facing our country, and how do those issues intersect with gender and broader diversity, equity, and inclusion issues? So I think we've started down this path, and I'm just going to prompt us to continue down it a little further. So would anyone like to start the conversation?
I'm happy to.
Great,
well,
thank you.
Yeah, I think certainly climate change has to be at the top, if not near the top of the agenda terms of it's not just emerging, it's already with us, but certainly the forecasts ahead. And I think it needs to be on the agenda, both in terms of mitigation and adaptation, because it's a bit too late to just assume that we're not going to have even greater negative effects today. So helping people to adapt to the changing climate, I think, is an essential policy and essential issue to be addressed. And I think that means we need more policies to ensure greater resilience for all. And that gets back into the inclusion and making sure that we're not excluding certain populations, and not just within this country, but globally, because this is an issue in which the wealthy probably will get wealthier, whether it's at the country level, because there are northern countries that are going to be less affected by some of the impacts, or because they already have the financial resources to adapt to the extent possible. And the poorer countries, particularly in the global south, they're going to be worse off because although they weren't the cause, they certainly will be the consequences of climate change. So I think we have to, and a lot of the work on resilience building and on adaptation is focused on infrastructure, on the big, those very, very big and extremely important issues. Much less attention is being given to the human issues and how to create human security in the context of climate change. I look at it in the context of migration displacement. How do we find avenues for people to migrate when it's necessary, to remain in place when it's possible, and to not be displaced in a reactive form in a way in which they lose everything. And I think we need to be thinking more about issues of that sort, whether it's how to make poor women in rural areas in Africa better able to create alternative economic opportunities for themselves, or whether it's to deal with the infectious disease implications of climate change. We think COVID is bad. Some of the projections in terms of the impact that climate change will have on pandemics, indicates a much worse situation ahead of us. So that's where I think we have emerging issues. Too much focus is on right now on the kind of hard responses, and much too little is being done on the softer responses, but the ones that will ultimately save lives. And that's an equity and inclusion issue at its fundamental.
Yeah.
So,
all right.
So I want to kind of pick up on something from Susan's remarks. See, I come at things from the point of view of risk, and an underappreciated reality of a highly interconnected world of our globe is the fact that when there is a triggering event, that we all are subject to what I refer to as intersecting vulnerabilities with cascading consequences. And now the COVID-19 pandemic clearly is such a triggering event with enormous public health, social, economic, and obviously geopolitical consequences. And it has revealed in stark relief the intersecting vulnerabilities in our healthcare system, in supply chains, in employment policies, even in our political systems, and their abilities to mount coherent, interconnected responses. And all of this then has led to the cascading consequences of lost lives, resurgent outbreaks of COVID-19 disease, the kinds of overloaded medical systems that we've seen, economic weaknesses and shortages of key products that we depend upon. Now, these kinds of triggering events are increasingly difficult to avoid in a world where our challenges are both global and interlinked, including and maybe primarily, of course, because of climate change. But then there are the resultant challenges of securing food, water, and energy security for global population, the impact on human health and disease, what that means for national and global security, and then even looking at the intelligent allocation of natural resources and our need when people talk about climate change, and it's true, for sustainable infrastructure, materials, and systems. And so to me, we tend to talk about this risk here and that risk there, but intersecting vulnerabilities that can have cascading consequences mean that we have to have an approach, which is hard, but an approach to risk assessment that has to be more holistic and integrated, examining the effect of one risk on another with potential potentiating effects, with the effect of what happens in the natural world on what happens with human health and disease, with what happens with our physical infrastructure. And we see that and what it means. And so from the point of view then of the GAO and those of us who quote unquote advise the GAO, one of the things is how governments, including our own government, can go about this. And it's a hard topic, but if you don't think about it and try to do this kind of integrated, holistic way, then you miss things, including the overlap with diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we've seen many inequities play out during the COVID crisis. And so I don't have to quote you all the statistics about the death rates of African Americans and Hispanics and so on, and even pregnant women. But, you know, we have exposed a lot, but what's really been exposed is how all these things intersect and how they cascade through populations. And so we have to ask ourselves, you know, what vulnerabilities are we in fact creating by allowing social structures that disadvantage women and other population groups? You know, but then you put it into a context that allows for actionable things in terms of how these things propagate through a healthcare system that is inequitable, how these things propagate through infrastructure that doesn't exist in certain areas, and so on. And if we don't do that, then we're going to be, it's Groundhog Day. We just relive these things again and again. And so if I have one thing I really will certainly be pressing with the GAO, it's this issue of doing this holistic, integrated piece that doesn't just look at the physical, doesn't just look at the economic, but brings the human dimension in, but understand how these things are interlinked and can cause cascades that make things even worse than they would be if we were just looking down one avenue.
Thank you.
The way I'm looking at this right now, the threat that I see relates to a fundamental question about who's an American, and it plays out in several different ways. One of the ways is the big divide between rich and poor that is getting wider and wider, and who counts in terms of decision making, who's included, who sits at the table. We talked about this in terms of women. I think it's broader than that. I think that the second issue, which I think is the fundamentals of our society in America as we've known it, has to do with democracy, and our democracy being on life supports and at risk. And I think that there are several ways in which the GAO has responsibility, because the elements of what's included in a democracy, what the basic tenets are, includes free and fair elections. It includes the rule of law. It includes making sure that everybody's rights are protected, making sure that there are a bunch of principles that reflect that our democracy is healthy and in good shape, and it's not. And these issues didn't start in 2015. This is not just a political issue. This is, in fact, many people say that democracy dies by 1,000 strokes and by 1,000 cuts. It's not something that happens just over a couple of years, but the constant attack on our institutions, the undermining of our institutions, the fear that even the General Accountability Office can't even make certain kinds of recommendations for fear that this party or that party will accuse them of political bias and favoring the other side, when information is not credible anymore, and where people follow points of view and get reinforced by algorithms that allow them to just stay in their own small bubbles and be reinforced by the information that confirms their point of view to begin with. So I think our deep polarization, the questions that are being asked about who has the right to vote, should we change the system excluding people, I think is such a deep threat to our democracy. And to me, if we don't protect our democracy first, just about all else becomes compromised. And so, and I think if you conflate that or put that together with the increasing divide between rich and poor, and then overlay on that the deep polarization and the issues of race and exclusion, I think that we are at a crisis point right now.
Let me just say that, Diana, you've just articulated my thesis having to do with all of the intersecting vulnerabilities and risks and how they can cascade through societies. You mentioned the threat to democratic systems and so forth. One has to ask the question of how. And so one of the foci I have has to do with what people now refer to as epistemic security, meaning the issue of how do we recognize and what can we do about misinformation and disinformation that gets propagated through technologically enabled channels. And this is not looking at any given entity, but rather as a broader issue of how do the behavioral sciences come into what we do? How does bringing in diverse perspectives help us to know when there are danger signals? And these are real things. And so I'm a big proponent of having the behavioral and social sciences come together with the so-called computational and hard sciences and to bring in truly diverse perspectives so that one can recognize when there are things that are going awry that can have enormous consequence. And so I try to be visionary and speak out, but I'm also a pragmatist. And the real issue becomes, how do you get at these issues? And so that's why I do what I do.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for that. So we've talked a little bit about some of the things for, GAO to think about the going forward. But in reflecting on, work that you are familiar with that we've done, or a body of work that you've seen GAO complete, that has had a meaningful impact on the country. Could you talk a little bit about any of those areas that come to mind, kind of where we've had a meaningful impact and kind of why? What was it about that particular body of work or work that had the impact? And you've touched on some things, but if you have more to say about what GAO should consider going forward with respect to gender issues.
I'll make one simple statement. Let's go think through everything that my fellow panelists have talked about and put it into the context of human potential and human potential to address the great challenges before us, both to understand them and then to have solutions and pathways we could go down. And not just say, here are gender issues over here. Women are half the human race. And so, for us to kind of keep pigeonholing these things, I think it's important to bring them out, but it's important to have people understand that we fail if we don't deal with them. And that's really what I'm talking about.
Okay. No, thank you for that.
Yeah, one of the things that I think is underappreciated about GAO is that it's not the headline grabbing reports that have the most impact. It's really that sustained looking at whether or not government agencies are improving or receding in terms of their ability to do the functions that they're supposed to do. And that, I think, has a tremendous impact. Again, not because it's flashy, but because it actually is very practical and very important for agencies to get that type of feedback. What I'd like to see GAO do is some more systemic work, and I mentioned this before, on gender issues, so that it's not just doing the occasional report that comes out. And you know, I agree, there are a lot of reports that you've done a lot of work over the last decade or so that deal with gender issues. But GAO can get information and data, particularly administrative data, from government agencies that no one else can. I've seen it over and over again that being told, even commissions can often do that, but being told that, oh no, we can't share that data, and then you make a request that GAO ask for that data, and suddenly it's available on that because of your standing and because of the connection to Congress and all of that other stuff. So I think that if GAO on these issues of both gender diversity, but also as it connects to what we were talking about before in terms of other forms of exclusion, could really get government agencies to be more systematic in looking at the systemic problems. All of those neutral policies that are not neutral, even though they sound like they should be, but have disproportional impacts on particular populations. I think that would be a tremendous benefit to the country, and given GAO's role in educating other governments as to what their accountability institutions can do, it could have a tremendous impact globally as well, because it's playing to your strength. And it's a strength and access to information that the rest of us just don't get.
I think that that GAO underestimates the degree of its own importance in terms of sharing the information, and more than that, attitudes towards government right now are at a historic low. There's trust in government, belief in institutions, and so forth. One of the reasons to believe in government is that we've got a system of checks and balances. And this is the system of checks and balances. If members of Congress don't always listen to what the GAO said, there are lots of other people who do, and there are lots of other people who are imbued with enthusiasm that at least if somebody's trying to stop an inspector general's report or whatever, that there are others who are in place to look at that and to assess it and to do the hard, solid background, as Susan said, not the loud, flashy kinds of reports, but the solid work that is being done. I must tell you that every time I've talked with my friends, they've asked me why do I serve on this board and what does the GAO do? And every time I share with what they do, they want more information. They want to know more about it. So to me, this becomes the poster child for effective government, that there are checks and balances, that there is an institution that thinks long-term, intermediate term, and short-term, and is working with agencies to try and do the right thing. Now, I wish members of Congress would be more attentive to what you do and act on that. And that's where the people come in. Because if the people knew and understood how important these reports are and said to their lawmakers, pay attention, then we have a system in place that can really work. But keep doing what you're doing.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for that. So across your various fields of expertise, Which issues are persistent challenges? So are there trends that you've observed in how government or the private and nonprofit sectors are trying to address those challenges? So we really want to think about any trends that you're seeing and how folks are trying to address them.
That's a very broad question. So, Oris, I'm not quite sure what you're asking. I think that in the space that I've moved into, which is the organization called the Partnership for American Democracy, the reason I went there is because I think that our government is failing us in that area, and that we don't have enough checks and balances to protect ourselves. You know, and there are four threats to democracy. You know, one is political polarization. The second one is conflict over who belongs as a member of the political community, particularly along lines of race, ethnicity, and national origin. Third one is high and growing economic inequality. And the fourth one is excessive executive power or abuse of executive power. Now, in many societies and countries around the world, you just need one or two of those, and you have a society at risk. I would say in the last couple of years, there are lots of experts who think that all four of those factors are at play in the United States, and that we've moved in the past 10 years, not just the past 5 years, the past 10 years, to being number 22. We've lowered our scale of being a highly effective democracy, much lower down. And I think that the risks that we face when our institutions don't talk to each other, when the battles, when any of the people who've worked with members of Congress, I for many years served as a person who tried to advocate and lobby both sides of the aisle on issues. And we all understood the difference between the rhetorical flourishes of each of the political parties and then the work that they did behind closed doors. Now that doesn't happen anymore. In fact, we are the ones who share with the one party what the other party is thinking, which gives too much power to lobbyists, particularly in the business community. We have a system that's broken. And I think that if we don't fix it, we do it at our own peril. What the GAO's role is in regard to this, you know, I had this very conversation with Jean Dodaro just a couple of days ago, and he's articulated that there are 2 or 3 areas in which there is opportunity for deeper thinking. And what I encourage you to do is to talk to those experts in the field. Shirley mentioned the misinformation, disinformation. I can't even begin to describe to you how much that is a profound problem, and it plays out in all sorts of ways. Most recently, we're seeing young teenage girls being driven or drawn to social media where the messages that they're seeing because of the algorithms are the most negative messages, because that keeps eyeballs on those particular websites. Well, what is government's role in response to that? And then what is GAO's role to make sure that government oversees and fulfills its responsibilities? This is, again, interconnected, as Shirley has pointed out earlier, and I think a very serious risk if we don't pay close attention to it right now.
No, thank you for that.
I think that I'd highlight, two things. Well, 3. We've got to jump into cyberspace a little bit more. On the one hand, there are issues having to do with cybersecurity, how we protect the parts of cyberspace that have to do with the fundamental functioning of institutions, that have to do with our fundamental infrastructure that we depend upon for things in our daily lives, the so-called cyber physical threats. And so there's some things in the technological realm that we need to think about, things like artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and quantum communications. And other countries are pursuing these things. And so we have to think about that. At the same time, we've got to think about that intersection of the cyber with humans. And that's why I brought up the epistemic security, because the things that create distrust of institutions, of people, to move people into tribal camps and so on, they can be enhanced, and there's an exploitation that can occur through the use of technologies. And so the way we have to deal with it, because any technology sits on a knife edge, as I like to say, and it can be used for good or ill. And so we have to have an institution, and I think the GAO is in that position, to elucidate a little more these knife edge issues. Okay. And because if we don't want things to just run away. The other has to do in a different way that you might not expect me to talk about, but it really has to do with demographic challenges and the fact that there's this what I'll call the demographic divergence with the developing world aging and with the developed world aging and the developing world being younger. And so worldwide, more than half of the population growth between now and 2050 is expected, if they don't get killed off by disease, is expected to occur in South Africa, particularly sub-Saharan Africa. But then for the developed world, we have a shrinking working age population. And the working age population that we're going to have is made up of what are our historical underrepresented minority groups. And so the real question becomes one of developing human potential, both from a national perspective, but a global perspective. But we ourselves have to think through how do we create a less polarized and more coherent approach to immigration? Because we do face a demographic gap with respect to our working age populations between the retiring baby boomers and the gens, I'll call them, what you fill in X, Z, whatever, that follow. And so just as the GAO talked about disparities and health disparities between different women from different ethnic groups, we're going to need to face this question of both our domestic demographic challenge, but implications around the world. And so those two things, one that's very technologically rooted, but that intersects with how people interact and trust each other, trust institutions, and so on. But the other, a very human one, but one that plays into an important but fraught policy area. And it's one that I think, more attention has to be given to.
Yeah, I'll pick up on threads of both Diana and Shirley's comments, because I think the failure of immigration reform in this country over the last 30 some odd years is really both a cause of some of the problems that Diana mentioned, as well as Shirley, the problems in terms of our democracy and also in terms of our human potential, but has also become almost impossible because of all those manifestations of polarization, lack of an understanding of what it doesn't mean to be an American, and how has immigration changed us in good ways and bad ways, and how we deal with those issues. And I must admit, I'm quite pessimistic about where we go in the future on immigration. I think that for a long time, we've known the contours of what is needed. I think there's actually relatively little disagreement about what we need in the way of immigration reform, and yet an impossibility over the last number of years to come up with the formulation that people actually can come on board and pass legislation. It's not the first time in our history that this has happened. Immigration reform has always been the exception rather than the norm. It usually takes 50, 60 years in between major reforms to get the momentum to do the next set. We see the problems much more than we agree to what are the solutions in a realistic manner. But I think GAO can still do a lot of very, very useful work in the immigration arena. I think not just the technical side of managing the programs, you've done a lot on detention, on deportation, and other issues, employer sanctions, going further back on it. But I think that some of these more fundamental issues that we've been talking about today, and particularly that Diana and Charlie just discussed, has to be at the forefront of GAO's work, and not saying how any one specific immigration policy is working, but how does it all come together in a way that we can restore faith in our democracy because the public is not scared to death of the other. And not trust our immigration system in a way that they think will protect them from that other, but instead embrace them. Again, we've gone through this before. We have the national origins quotas. We had the Chinese Exclusion Act. We've had lots of different exclusionary periods in our history, but we can't allow them to continue indefinitely. And there needs to be some shift in the way in which we think about the issues overall, not just in terms of each specific policy framework.
Great. So thank you all so much for your participation. It's been my pleasure moderating this panel discussion. I think you've given us all a lot of food for thought. So I want to thank you again for your continued service on the Comptroller General's Advisory Board. I know you all are a trusted resource for him and the rest of the EC. So I think we're going to move to our Q&A portion from the audience. So I am going to turn the mic, if you will, over to Layla, and I am going to turn off my camera and mic. Thank you again.
Thanks, Doris. Thank you so much to the panelists. That was so great. I have some questions in our chat box coming in. If you have questions for the panelists, please type them into the chat box. So this first question is for Dr. Jackson. It's an honor to hear you speak, especially about your experience in overcoming racism and sexism as a Black university student studying STEM in 1950 segregated America. Regarding your statement that helped you through all that, heritage is by chance, success is by choice, what encouragement would you give to those women, especially women of color, who have been discouraged perhaps by a lack of support by those in power to leave STEM careers? And just to broaden that out, you did talk about how women are getting fewer and fewer degrees in computer science and not majoring in STEM and leaving that profession. How do you encourage more women and people of color to stay in STEM, to be in STEM?
Well, each person and each woman, each person of color walks his or her own path. And so I try to be a little bit careful about transferring everything from my life onto theirs, because I don't know all of the challenges specifically that any given individual faces. But I will say the following, that this is how I think about it. One, I've always felt that there was never any place that anyone else should be that I cannot be. And so that has guided me a lot. The second is that one can face real discrimination, real inhibition in trying to achieve a goal. But my father said something to me years and years ago when I was really young. And by the way, I was more a college student in the 60s, not the 50s. So, and he always said to me, aim for the stars to reach the treetops. And at any rate, you get off the ground. And his point being, if you don't aim high, you won't go far. That you may not get to every place you want to go, but you'll certainly get further down the road. And that's been another kind of governing principle of mine. And then the third is to, if one is blessed with health and opportunity and ability, to help someone else along the way, because true success links to how you relate to the people around you. And it also has an important role in keeping you from getting really tied into all that is happening to you. And I say that even though I know there are people who face food insecurity. There are people who are in difficult financial straits. But you know, life has a way of dealing all of us a hand at some point, whether it relates to health or financial stability or discrimination. And in the end, as you think through a lot of what we've been talking about, it really is about people's connections to each other and understanding each person's humanity. And people have things that they're afraid of, and that can make them really behave in very ugly ways. But many times it's rooted in fear, or they're trying to get what you're trying to get. And I'm not saying there's some little simple way to deal with these, but don't let other people put a limit on what you can do. Aim as high as you can, and then try to help someone else along the way. It'll make you feel better. Thank you.
Thank you. So we have a couple questions related to COVID. This person asks, I think a lot of working parents, especially women, have hit their limits with COVID related to shutdowns and daycare and school closures. What are your thoughts about how this latest crisis might impact U.S. policies going forward to support families and improve our ability to develop human potential in this country? So a couple of you touched on this a bit. I don't know if Dr. Forbes or Dr. Jackson, Ms. Aviv, too, if you'd like to answer, but.
I'll give it a start. And I saw earlier there was another COVID question about climate change and would COVID, change people's attitudes towards climate. And I wish the answer to that was yes. I don't intend to be negative because usually I'm a very positive person. But my concern is that the COVID experience has been politicized in a way in which the wearing of masks, the getting of vaccinations, taking some kind of medication, if one does contract COVID, have all become political statements about identity politics. And because of that, the opportunity to learn from this, not just where it came from, but how to prevent future pandemics and then what to do about them, doesn't seem to be the national lesson that we're learning right now. And at the same time, I think that if you look at the politics of what's happening in Washington on Capitol Hill right now about legislation that's designed, some legislation that the one side believes is designed to actually address these issues and to provide more childcare and all kinds of backup supports for working families, which disproportionately the responsibilities of family fall on women. And the other side saying that it's just too expensive, we can't do that, means that these issues are not being framed in terms of what's in the public interest, how do we get people out to work, and how do we solve these issues so that both families have adequate childcare and women are not placed in a position where they have to choose between these issues. And just one last point I want to share with you. A few years ago, I was invited to give a speech in Japan, and prior to my speech, I was taken on a tour to see different kinds of programs in the social sector. And one of the programs they took me to was a very well-heeled childcare center. And I couldn't really understand why they were sharing this with me. And so I asked them, and they said, because what had happened in Japan at that time is that increasingly women weren't having babies because work didn't have childcare friendly policies. And women knew that if they had babies and they had to take time off work to take care of their children, that they might lose their jobs. So they stopped having children. And so there was a negative population growth rate. And so government in its wisdom and employers then began to change their policies. So partly what we have to do, I think, is to depoliticize these fundamental needs that we have to have a robust, healthy economy with men and women working, including child rearing age people working, by having support systems that allow them to do that. We haven't gotten there quite yet.
Yeah, if I could follow up on Diana, I think you're absolutely correct that the sort of fundamentally the problem we're having in legislation like what may go through on reconciliation, if the Democrats can figure amongst themselves what to do, is that we start with bottom financial lines rather than start with what the needs are and figure out what the price is based on that assessment. It's actually very similar to what we do with the immigration system. We set a number of immigrants to come in rather than set a set of priorities and figure out what numbers we need in order to fulfill those priorities. So we do it in a lot of different ways, and that's a role that I think that GAO can play in terms of really helping Congress think through what is needed and what is the minimum price that we can attach. It's something that the budget office doesn't really do. They wait for the Congress to give them a package of stuff and then they price it out. But I think GAO is maybe better positioned to look at a set of priorities and then help them figure out what to do with those sets of priorities. And the respect to that question, but on the one about whether COVID will help be more globally aware and do things more globally. I wish I could be more optimistic about that and what its impact is for climate change. But again, partly because of the political polarization that we're having, rather than have a global response to a pandemic, which is clearly a global phenomenon, we've reverted in so many countries to a nationalist position, and trying to reverse that has been extremely difficult on COVID. And what I worry about is that will be the message moving forward with climate change. Every country for itself and what it can do and what's the minimum that they have to do, rather than thinking about what are the needs of the countries that are going to be most hit and what can we all do in order to be able to ensure that we work from the bottom up, not the top down. It shouldn't be a trickle down approach on vaccines any more than it can be a trickle down approach on climate change.
Thank you. Dr. Jackson, did you want to add to this or?
Well, I think they've articulated things quite well. Again, I think a lot of what we talk about in terms of the responses links to the communications issues and how things are articulated. It also has to do with lack of data sharing. so that the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. That can be in terms of intergovernmental information exchange. It can be between the government and municipalities. It can be between nations. And because in the end, if people are allowed to just stay where they are and there's no new information coming in, then that doesn't engender real solutions, and that does not engender understanding. And so, but I think these two ladies have articulated things quite well. So
Great, thank you. So this next question is for Ms. Aviv. We are inundated every day with all sorts of information, factual, misinformation, and disinformation, but it's very difficult to distinguish what is your opinion or prescription on the validation and verification of information, because not all fact checkers are the same.
That's true. Not all fact checkers are the same. And that's true in any profession or any field, that you'll have high quality professionals and medium quality professionals and those that need to improve their work. There was a theorist many years ago by the name of Festinger who's had a theory of cognitive dissonance that said that if the facts don't comport with your belief, you disbelieve the facts. We're right now living in a time where people start with their beliefs and then search for so-called facts. One person in politics once called it alternative facts, but search for facts that comport with people's beliefs. I think that we also have a crisis in journalism, where most of our local newspapers have been bought up or have become bankrupt. And so when most people in the past would get their news from local community journalists who they knew, who they went to the diner and met on a Sunday morning or a Saturday afternoon, whose kids played on the soccer fields or football fields together, all of that, that's disappeared. And so instead we have a series of national broadcast systems, and that tend to tilt in one particular political direction or another, and that the opinion makers and the fact and those who do reporting of the news become blurred. And what we need is to invest once again in local journalism, where the people know who those folks are and where the facts have some kind of evidence-based reporting, but that it's not just about evidence-based, it's about trusting the messengers who are providing the news. And that news isn't only coming from their local leaders, their tribal leaders, their leaders of faith, whoever those leaders are, if those leaders are not basing their opinions on fact, but rather just reinforcing their opinions. We have a big job to do, but I think that the breakdown of the American journalism profession is inextricably tied into what we're talking about. And we need some serious investment in that. There are, on the positive side, there's a lot of work being done in this area. And there are all kinds of suggestions and ideas about how to go about doing this. There are solutions that I think can begin to solve this problem. Maybe at another point we can have a conversation about that.
Okay, great. Thank you. So we have a question here, and I'm going to paraphrase this a little bit. This is coming from one of the project managers at GAO who helps design the engagement. And she's saying that there's often a feeling at GAO that there's often a feeling that GAO needs to prove its value through financial accomplishments and recommendations implemented. And that leads us to only look at things that we can fix or design jobs that are scoped to look at a narrow problem. But some of the issues we discussed in this conversation today are much broader than that, much bigger, challenging issues. So how can we show Congress that GAO can add value by examining difficult national issues, even if it doesn't lead to a recommendation? And I think this also gets at what Dr. Jackson was saying a little bit about using a holistic approach. So I can turn it over to Dr. Jackson, but I think if all of you could comment on this.
Well, in some ways, Leila, embedded in the way you asked the question is the beginning of an answer. Let's say that I'm not going to agree or disagree with what the premise of the question is, but let's assume that the GAO looks at this and then it looks at that and it looks at that. There can be value in taking studies that have been done and that the GAO does, and periodically looking at them for cross-cutting issues and extracting from them their implications for the larger, harder questions and challenges, and using the very data and findings that have come from what may look like smaller studies to look at these intersections. Because I think that's how one can begin to magnify and have effect. I recognize that the GAO does studies and it's tasked many by the Congress and so on to look at certain things, but there can be value in stepping back and looking at what river runs through it all. And I think that in and of itself can be its own value add, because I dealt a fair amount with the Congress when I was chair of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And the one thing I'll say is these people are going a mile a minute. They are busy, and I'm not opining on any political views or anything, but they have a lot that they're dealing with. And so they're going to ask for what they ask for. And so the question becomes, how can one take the very work that one does here, 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 and here, and be deliberate about understanding where those intersections are and highlighting those when one is providing context for any given report, or just looking generally at how things intersect and potentiate. I think that is one way, to begin to get at some of this.
Yeah, I think also my experience with Congress has been that there are always a few champions of seeing the broader picture and wanting that perspective, which isn't offering up simple recommendations, but that we know can be done, as important as those are, as I've mentioned before, but who want to see how all of the pieces fit together and what we don't know, but need to learn. And I think cultivating those members can, so that GAO routinely does get requests that are broader in scope and not about a specific legislative proposal or program that's been started. I must admit, one of the reasons that I was so happy to join the advisory board was that David and then Jean made it very, very clear that they wanted from us that broader picture, that they didn't want to get bogged down in very specifics. We have a round robin at each meeting where we're free to talk about whatever we think are the big issues coming up. And so I think without that, I would have been much less interested in participating in it, but knowing that there was an appetite at the top of the agency to be able to move in the direction that you're talking about in the question, I think means just taking some next steps to get the encouragement that's needed, as well as the funding.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we are at time. We had another question, but we're not able to get to it, sadly. And I know I don't speak for myself. I'm sure everybody else feels this way, but I could listen to you all talk all day and hear from your backgrounds and your perspectives. This has been really wonderful. Thank you so much for giving us your time and lending your insights and sharing some of your backgrounds with us. I am going to turn it back over to Rachel to close out our session. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you, Layla. I'd like to echo you in giving a tremendous thank you to our panelists, Diana Aviv, Dr. Shirley Ann Jackson, and Dr. Susan Forbes-Martin for such an insightful and inspirational discussion. It's always heartening to hear about the importance of GAO work and how GAO work is being used. And I'd also say that it's both exciting and intimidating to contemplate what the next 100 years will hold for GAO, but we do take comfort in knowing that the agency is going to continue to benefit from your guidance as we move forward. The COP is also extremely grateful to our moderator, Oris Williams-Brown, for facilitating such an excellent discussion today. We'd like to thank our senior executive sponsor, Jackie Nowicki, as well as the managing director of SPELL, Steve Sanford, for all the guidance and advice that they provided to us in planning today's event. We give a special thank you to Brody Garner, also in SPELL, who operated the technology that we're using today. And finally, I'd like to thank all of my fellow COP steering committee members for their assistance with this event, particularly Layla and Nora Beretti, who played really pivotal roles in organizing, advertising, and facilitating the event. Thank you all so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at a future COP event.